Hey y'all, it is Cambria back again with Cambria's Corner. Today we are going to talk about the history of slavery, Jim Crow law era, redlining, and mass incarceration. Obviously, with everything going on, it's really important to know our history, the racial injustices that are not only going on today, but have been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years since our foundation. I'm making this tool as an educational resource, not only about US history, but also the ways that we can look further into social justice and the need for change in our systems, especially since a lot of the times we don't learn about these things in our history books or they're often glazed over. All right, so we're going to get straight into the issue of slavery, which was an ongoing issue ever since the first colonists came to America and up until 1865 with the Civil War, but we will get there in due time. First of all, Spain was coming to the Americas in the 1400s and 1500s. They kind of opened up the doors, Spain and Portugal did. Christopher Columbus is often credited with discovering America, but obviously we know that there were indigenous peoples there long before Christopher Columbus was, and he actually participated in a lot of murder and conquest of these indigenous peoples and groups. When Spanish colonists, as well as Portuguese colonists and other European colonists came over, they came to land looking to exploit its natural resources, which for the case of South America, there was a lot of talk about there being gold. And that's what in the late 1500s and 1600s, English colonists were looking for. They had been reading Spanish logs looking for gold. So this meant they needed more labor than just themselves coming over. And it's interesting just to look at the narrative of colonists coming over for the first time. We think of these people as the pilgrims coming over on the Mayflower, taking this great big journey. And yes, it was a long journey, but it's also important to note that a lot of people came over as indentured servants. So this was white, poor Europeans coming over to do work for a set period of time. They had a contract with the upper class elite who were coming over on behalf of the government to take over the lands. This meant that indentured servants were working for their freedom, usually around 7 years that they worked until they were able to go be free men. However, there's also the case of Black slaves that were being brought over from Africa. The slave trade oftentimes would go from Africa to Europe to the Americas. This was the case for North and South America. In South America, they were using slave labor for sugar plantations. In the Caribbean, as well as to try and exploit more natural resources. It's important to note that the idea of race did actually not become heavily solidified within society until the upper elite class actually became afraid that the lower class, white, poor European indentured servants and the slaves would band up together because they were commonly poor and rise up against the elite class. This is when the rhetoric of whiteness really became solidified in American society because these upper class elite members of the colonies were talking to the lower class indentured servants and using their common whiteness as a way to other themselves from the Black slaves so that these lower class white European indentured servants who were working for their freedom would not band together with the slaves to revolt. All right, so going from there, the colonies were under British rule for quite some time, obviously leading up to the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution. I'm actually filming this on the 4th of July, and so it's actually interesting to note that while it was freedom and independence for the colony as a whole, slaves were still seen as property and only counted as 3/5 of a vote. The reason for this being wasn't even that they wanted them to have political say. Rather, people in the South were disproportionately Black because they were slaves. There were less white slave owners than in other places, such as the cities that were forming in Boston and to the north, and they still wanted to have a say in the economy and politics, and so they wanted to count their slaves as a vote so they could have more of a voice, not the slaves having more of a voice. Slavery continued to go on with cotton plantations and other forms of forced labor up until the Civil War, which was when the South wanted to secede from the Union and form the Confederacy. And in the North, Quakers and other religious groups were forming abolitionist coalitions to try and free slaves in the South. However, the South obviously did not like that because a lot of their economic prosperity came from their slaves and the labor that they got from them. A lot of times people look at Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator, and while he did end up leading the Civil War and also doing legislation to free slaves, it actually wasn't until partway through the Civil War that he took the side of freedom for slaves. He initially was impartial and had to choose a side. Also, even partway through the war, you can see in some of his addresses that he allowed slave owners to keep their slaves in certain territories so he could make negotiations with the South so that they would stay. It was not until the end of the Civil War that Lincoln actually took up a firmer stance on abolishing slavery, and this came with the end of the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. However, even then, all slaves weren't freed until 1865, when a legislator in Texas actually went to slave owners and let the slaves know that they were freed. This is seen by the holiday Juneteenth that we still celebrate today, commemorating the actual freedom of slaves in 1865, 2 years later after the Emancipation Proclamation. Alright, so this leads us into our next era, the Jim Crow era. So immediately following the Civil War, it's important to note that for about 15 years, there was the idea of Reconstruction. And this was a grand idea to reconstruct the South and include more opportunities for recently freed slaves. However, about after 10 to 15 years, people had completely forgotten the Civil War, it seems like, and had moved into an era of segregation. This is seen by segregated water fountains, segregated bathrooms, segregated restaurants, schools, etc. In 1986, the case Plessy v. Ferguson was presented, which ended up ruling that people can be separate but equal, which again reinforced segregation in society by saying, oh, it's fine, we're separate, but they're still technically equal, which obviously we know now was completely and terribly wrong. However, this continued on for decades. This notion of separate but equal was challenged then by the Supreme Court in 1954, which was over 60 years after Plessy v. Ferguson, and it ruled that separate but equal is not constitutional and was the start of integrating schools and other public spaces. While many people look at this as a landmark case, and while it certainly is in many respects, it actually had a lot of negative consequences on Black communities. First of all, you're mixing Black students and white students together. Many of these white students and their family had heavy racial biases against the Black students, which made it difficult for them to learn in a safe environment and feel safe in these environments. Second of all, so many Black teachers got laid off in this process of integrating schools. While they integrated schools and students got to move to white schools and white students were moved to historically Black schools in some cases, they ended up keeping on mostly white teachers. Only a few Black teachers were actually kept on throughout the United States of America, which meant that there was a disproportionate rate of white educators teaching these new integrated classrooms, a lot of them with the same racial biases as the students had. Surrounding the Brown versus Board of Education was the civil rights movement that we often look back at and look at figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, these people leading movements for equality and racial justice. We tend to look back on these events with a rose-colored lenses. It is important to note that Martin Luther King Jr. during the civil rights movement had a 25% approval rating at his best. That meant the American general public actually, for the most part, disliked him and felt very strongly that they were against what he was advocating for in terms of social justice and equality for all Americans. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, which outlawed discrimination against race and a plethora of other issues, as well as created more equal footing for voter registration so that more Black communities could have access to voting for the future. However, while this was supposed to be the end of discrimination on paper, it certainly was not for American society. Martin Luther King Jr., as we talked about before, he was assassinated in 1968. Even after the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, redlining continued to be an issue. Redlining, for those of you who aren't familiar, is basically a term for the segregation of neighborhoods on behalf of banks and real estate agents who deemed Black families riskier lenders, and real estate agents could actually lose their licenses for selling homes to risky families or in risky neighborhoods. Redlining was deemed illegal with the Fair Housing Act of 1968. However, segregation continued to happen, especially because education funding comes from property taxes. Schools in predominantly Black neighborhoods had less funding, mostly because there were less job opportunities, and socioeconomic standing for these segregated Black neighborhoods were less than obviously the more elite, richer white families, even just middle-class families. Redlining obviously had socioeconomic impacts long past the 1960s due to the stigmas it sent against risky lenders and risky families, as well as disproportionate educational funding based on property taxes. This leads us to the era of mass incarceration to the present. In the 1970s, President Nixon launched the War on Drugs, which was supposed to be the American way of getting rid of recreational drugs such as cocaine and marijuana in their neighborhoods and communities to create safer and healthier neighborhoods. However, this also disproportionately targeted Black neighborhoods and young Black men. Police officers weren't hovering around white suburbs looking for suspects, rather were more heavily enforcing the war on drugs in Black neighborhoods, which meant that young Black men were more frequently targeted. Many of these people got sentences for decades, whereas study shows that white people caught with these same drugs, whether it was cocaine or marijuana, were charged with less of a sentence and sometimes did not even go to jail. White people charged with the same crime had disproportionately less prison time and even went without being charged. This also creates a racial socioeconomic issue as we look at bail. So bails are set by judges and are oftentimes influenced by prosecutors who are bringing people in and fighting against individuals on their case. It has also been found statistically that higher bails are set for people of color and Black individuals than white people. Oftentimes, even if white people have larger bails for larger crimes, they're able to pay it and get out of it because of leniency by judges or just a better access to money and resources. Black individuals who aren't able to raise bail sit in jail for longer amounts of time, and oftentimes courts can easily push back hearings for years. So there are people who have been sitting in jail for years because they cannot post bail and have committed the same crimes as other Americans who are white or have more money and are able to go free while they wait for their trial. This is an issue that carries in today as we see that the number of Black people and other people of color in prisons is much higher than white folks. All right, so that is a history lesson of slavery to today. If I forgot anything, please feel free to add in the comments out. It's a lot to cover, so obviously I'm not going to be able to cover every single thing. However, I do think this is something that is so important to reflect on, especially with all the fights against racial injustice that are going on today, and as we learn to listen and be better allies for Black communities and other people of color in America. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more videos. And feel free to leave comments if I have left anything out or you have anything you would like to add. Again, I want this to be an educational resource. Thank you for watching, and I hope you continue to educate yourselves.